She whispered it like a prayer against the howling wind. A plea so strange, so out of place, it cut through the cold deeper than any icicle. Please, she begged, her lips blue, her body shivering in his arms. Please don't look at my back. Caleb Rohr, a man made of mountain rock and grizzly grit, had seen his share of strange things in the Rockies. He'd seen blizzards that swallowed the sun and beasts that walked like men. But he'd never heard a request like this. Not from a woman he'd just pulled from a snowdrift. A woman hovering on the edge of life itself. He carried her into his cabin, the warmth of the hearth a stark contrast to the deathly chill clinging to her skin. He was a trapper, a loner. His world was simple. Hunt, survive, be left alone. This woman, this Eliza Greyhawk, was anything but simple. As he laid her on his cot, her soaked clothes clinging to her frail frame, she said it again, her voice a thread of sound in the crackling silence. Promise me, you won't look at my back. Caleb was a man of his word. He nodded, his brow furrowed. You have my word, ma'am. He turned away, giving her privacy to change into one of his dry, oversized shirts. He stoked the fire, his mind racing. What could be so terrible on a person's back that they'd rather freeze to death than have it seen? He heard a sharp intake of breath, a hiss of pain as fabric pulled away from skin, and then a sickeningly soft thud. Caleb spun around. Eliza had fainted. She lay face down on the floor, the quilt having slipped away. His shirt was only half on, exposing the skin from her shoulders to her waist. And what he saw there made his blood run cold. It wasn't a birthmark. It wasn't a simple scar from a fall. Her back was a roadmap of pure agony, a crisscrossing network of raised pale lines, thick as his thumb in some places, thin as wire in others. They were lash marks, old, healed, but brutally clear, a story of unimaginable cruelty carved directly into her flesh. Caleb felt a ghost of a pain echo across his own back. He felt the phantom sting of a whip he hadn't felt in years. He knew this pattern. He knew this pain, because as he stood there, watching this broken woman by his fire, a single hot tear rolled down his weathered cheek and fell to the floor. The world outside his cabin dissolved. The howling wind, the falling snow, it all faded away. There was only the firelight, the woman, and a secret he thought he'd buried forever. A secret that was now staring back at him, etched into the skin of a complete stranger. How was this possible? He stumbled backward, his hand flying to his own chest, fumbling with the buttons of his flannel shirt. He had to be sure. He had to see. With trembling fingers, he pulled the fabric apart, shrugged it off his shoulders, and turned his own back to the small, cracked mirror hanging by the door. The firelight illuminated his reflection, and there they were, the same pattern, the same thick, ropey scars, the same story of a whip and a post and a pain that never truly leaves you. They were identical. Eliza wasn't just a woman who had been lashed. She had been lashed in the exact same way, with the exact same purpose as he had. It wasn't a coincidence. This was a signature, a brand. His mind reeled, the war, the false accusation of desertion, the choice he was given, firing squad or the lash. He chose the lash, 100 stripes that carved a message of shame into his back. He'd fled to the mountains to escape that shame, to hide the marks that separated him from other men. But here, in the heart of his isolation, that shame had found him. It had walked into his cabin on the feet of a half-frozen woman. Eliza began to stir, a low moan escaping her lips. Caleb quickly pulled his shirt back on, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. He knelt beside her, gently helping her back onto the cot. Her eyes fluttered open, filled with a dizzying mix of pain and horror, as she realized her back had been exposed. "You saw," she whispered, her voice cracking. Shame washed over her face, so potent it was almost a physical thing. Caleb couldn't speak. He just nodded, his throat tight. "I'm so sorry," she choked out, tears streaming down her face now. "I tried. I didn't want anyone." "Don't," Caleb managed to say, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "Don't you dare apologize." He took a deep breath, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. They called it the Redeemer, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Eliza's head snapped up, her eyes, wide and filled with disbelief, locked onto his. No one knew that name. It was the secret name the guards at the institution gave the whip, the one they used to redeem the savage out of the native children stolen from their families. How? How do you know that name? She breathed. Instead of answering, Caleb slowly, deliberately unbuttoned his shirt again. He didn't turn to the mirror this time. He turned to her. He showed her the canvas of his own suffering. Eliza gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She stared, her eyes tracing the familiar, hateful pattern. It wasn't just similar. It was the same. Every brutal line, every overlapping scar, a mirror of her own. You, she stammered. You were at the Carlisle school? Caleb shook his head. No, a Confederate prison camp. They used it on deserters, or men they accused of being deserters. The realization hit them both at the same time, a silent thunderclap in the small cabin. This wasn't just a shared trauma, it was a shared enemy. The man who had designed this specific, sadistic pattern of lashing, this redeemer, hadn't stayed in one place. His cruelty had spread like a plague. I'm looking for my brother, Eliza said suddenly, the words spilling out of her in a rush. His name is David. He has the marks too. He escaped the school a month ago. I have to find him before they do. Caleb's gaze hardened. This was no longer about a chance encounter in a storm. This was about something more, a reckoning. We'll find him, Caleb said, his voice a low growl of pure conviction. Together. He looked at this woman, this stranger who wore his own pain on her skin, and he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that his life of solitude was over. The storm had brought him more than a guest. It had brought him a mission, and maybe, just maybe, a chance at redemption that had nothing to do with a whip. The next morning, the world was a clean slate of white snow and brilliant blue sky. The fury of the storm was gone. But inside the cabin, a new storm was brewing. They spoke in hushed tones, piecing together a puzzle of pain and survival. Eliza told him about the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, a place that promised education but delivered brutal assimilation. Children's names were changed, their hair cut, their language forbidden. And for those who resisted, there was the Redeemer. Caleb listened, his own memories of the prison camp bubbling to the surface. The guards' sneering faces, the smell of sweat and fear. The man who wielded the whip, a hulking brute with a tattoo of a coiled snake on his forearm. A snake, Eliza whispered, her eyes wide. The headmaster at Carlisle. He had a tattoo, a coiled snake on his arm. It was him, the same man. His name was Silas Kane, a name that now tasted like poison on their tongues. Kane had moved from torturing soldiers to torturing children, perfecting his craft of breaking spirits. David ran because he found something, Eliza explained, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and pride. Kane has a ledger, a black book where he details everything. The names of the children who didn't survive the discipline, the money he embezzled. David found it. I think he took it with him. Suddenly, it all made sense. They weren't just hunting a runaway. They were hunting an eyewitness who had stolen the evidence of their crimes. David wasn't just running for his life. He was a liability that had to be eliminated. We head to the nearest town, Caleb said, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. Alder Creek. It's a day's ride. We'll ask questions, see if anyone's seen a young boy traveling alone. He packed supplies with grim efficiency, jerky, hardtack, 2 rifles, and a box of ammunition. As he worked, he glanced at Eliza. The fear was still in her eyes, but something else was there now too. A flicker of hope, a dangerous, fragile thing in a world that had tried so hard to extinguish it. The journey to Alder Creek was tense. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a pursuing horse. Caleb's senses were on high alert, his hand never far from the rifle resting in his saddle scabbard. Eliza rode beside him, her gaze scanning the horizon, her back straight and proud despite the scars that lay beneath her coat. They talked more, filling the vast, snowy silence with their stories. They were no longer just 2 scarred survivors. They were allies, comrades forged in a fire of shared pain. He learned that her family name, Greyhawk, was a proud one, and that David was the only family she had left. She learned that Caleb had a family once, a wife and child lost to fever long before the war, a grief that had first driven him to the solitude of the mountains. As the sun began to dip low, casting long purple shadows across the snow, the ramshackle buildings of Alder Creek came into view. It was a typical frontier town, a single muddy street lined with a general store, a saloon, and a marshal's office. Smoke curled from chimneys, promising warmth and shelter. But to Caleb and Eliza, it felt like walking into a trap. "We need to be careful," Caleb murmured, dismounting in front of the general store. "Let me do the talking." Eliza nodded, pulling her scarf tighter around her face, her eyes darting nervously. The store was warm and smelled of coffee, leather, and tobacco. A portly shopkeeper with a bushy mustache looked up as they entered. "Howdy, folks. What can I get for you?" "Evening," Caleb said, his voice casual. "Just need some coffee and flour. We're passing through. Been on the trail a while. Haven't seen another soul for days." He paused, leaning against the counter. "Haven't seen a young boy, have you? Native lad, 'bout 14, traveling alone." The shopkeeper's friendly demeanor vanished. A shuttered, cautious look came over his face. "Can't say I have," he said, his voice suddenly flat. He turned to measure out the flour, his back to them, but it was too late. From the back of the store, where two men sat playing checkers by a pot-bellied stove, a voice cut through the air. "You looking for the horse thief?" Caleb and Eliza froze. The man who spoke was lean and wiry, with a marshal's badge pinned to his vest. He rose slowly, his eyes, cold as chips of ice, fixed on Caleb. "We heard a posse rode out this morning," the marshal continued, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. "Hunting a half-breed kid who stole a prize stallion from the Bar T Ranch. Said he was headed for the canyons." "A horse thief?" Eliza blurted out, her voice trembling. "No, that can't be David. He would never—" The marshal's icy gaze shifted to her. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Funny thing," he said, taking a step closer. "The boy they're after, he's got a mess of scars on his back, like he's been acquainted with a whip." The air in the store went still. The friendly shopkeepers suddenly looked terrified. The checker players stared. Caleb's hand moved from the counter to his own pistol, his body tensing. He saw it then, a flash of silver and black on the marshal's forearm as his sleeve slid back. A tattoo of a coiled snake. It wasn't Silas Kane, but it was one of his men. The institution's reach extended all the way out here. They hadn't just sent a posse. They'd sent their own people. This wasn't a hunt for a horse thief. This was an execution squad, sanctioned by a badge. "We don't want any trouble, Marshal," Caleb said, his voice dangerously low. "We'll just take our supplies and be on our way." The marshal laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "I'm sure you will, but I gotta ask, why are two strangers so interested in a runaway Indian boy?" He took another step, his eyes locking onto Eliza's. "You look familiar, girl. You got a name?" Eliza shrank back, but Caleb stepped in front of her, shielding her. The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. This was it, the point of no return. The marshal knew who they were, or at least he suspected, and he wasn't going to let them leave. The bell above the door jingled, and for a heart-stopping second, Caleb thought the posse had returned. But it was just a drunk stumbling in from the saloon, oblivious to the life-or-death standoff unfolding before him. The momentary distraction was all Caleb needed. "Now!" he growled. In a single, fluid motion, he shoved the heavy sack of flour off the counter, sending it crashing into the marshal's legs. The lawman stumbled, a cloud of white powder erupting around him. In that split second of confusion, Caleb grabbed Eliza's hand and bolted for the door. "Get them!" the marshal roared, coughing on the flour. They burst out into the frigid night air, the sounds of shouting behind them. They didn't stop to think. They just ran. They scrambled for their horses, Caleb fumbling with the reins, his fingers numb with cold and adrenaline. A gunshot cracked through the night, a splinter of wood exploding from the post next to Caleb's head. He shoved Eliza onto her horse, slapping its rump hard. "Go! Ride for the canyons! Don't stop!" "What about you?" she cried, her face a pale oval in the moonlight. "I'll hold them off. I'll find you. Now go!" Caleb roared, drawing his own pistol. Another shot rang out, and Caleb felt a searing pain rip through his left arm. He gritted his teeth, ignoring the fire that was spreading through his shoulder. He turned and fired back into the darkness, not aiming to hit, but to slow them down. He saw Eliza disappear into the trees at the edge of town, a fleeting shadow against the snow. He sent a silent prayer after her, then ducked behind a water trough as bullets whizzed past his head. He was trapped, injured, and the entire town was turning against him. But as he reloaded his pistol, the warm blood soaking his sleeve, he felt a grim smile touch his lips. They thought he was just some trapper. They didn't know who they were dealing with. They didn't know the things he'd survived. They had branded his back and left him for dead once before. He'd be damned if he let them do it again. The hunt was on, but now the prey was hunting back. Caleb knew he couldn't stay put. The whole town was a hornet's nest he'd just kicked over. He fired 2 more shots toward the general store, providing enough cover to scramble away from the water trough and melt into the deeper shadows between the blacksmith's shop and the livery stable. His arm was on fire, a deep, throbbing ache that pulsed in time with his racing heart. He tore a strip of fabric from the bottom of his shirt and hastily tied a crude tourniquet above the wound, hissing through his teeth at the jolt of pain. He had to move. He had to get out of town and find Eliza and David before the marshal's posse did. The canyons. That's what the marshal had said. That's where they thought David was hiding. And that's where Eliza was now heading, alone. He slipped through the back of the livery, the smell of hay and manure thick in the air. The horses shifted nervously in their stalls, their warm breath misting in the cold. He needed a mount, but stealing one would just make him a bigger target. He had to be smarter than that. He crept to the back window, peering out. The marshal, the man with the snake tattoo, was barking orders, organizing a search party. Torches flared to life, casting dancing, monstrous shadows against the buildings. They were fanning out, a clumsy, angry mob. They weren't trackers, not like him. That was his advantage. He remembered a game trail he'd used years ago, one that bypassed the main road and cut straight north toward the labyrinth of rock and shadow they called the Devil's Jaw. It would be a hard climb, especially injured, but it was his only chance. He slipped out of the livery and, keeping to the darkness, made his way to the edge of town. Every dog that barked, every shutter that creaked, sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He moved like a ghost, a skill learned in the war and perfected in the wilderness. He was in his element now. The town was their territory. The wild was his. The climb was brutal. The wound in his arm throbbed with a vengeance, and he felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. He pressed on, fueled by a cold, hard rage. Rage at the man with the snake tattoo. Rage at Silas Kane. Rage at a world that allowed such evil to exist. And beneath the rage, a deep, gnawing fear for Eliza and her brother. He had made a promise. He would not break it. By sunrise, he was high in the foothills, looking down on the valley. He saw the posse, a line of ants crawling along the main trail below. They were miles behind him. He allowed himself a moment to rest, to clean and properly bandage his wound. The bullet had gone clean through, thankfully. It would hurt like hell, but it wouldn't kill him. Not yet. He chewed on a piece of jerky, his mind working. The marshal had called David a half-breed boy. It was a slur meant to dehumanize, to turn the town against a child. But it was also a clue. David was of mixed blood. Like Eliza, they were caught between 2 worlds belonging to neither, and hated by many. It explained the school, the attempt to civilize them. He pressed on, following the faint tracks left by Eliza's horse. She was riding hard, but she was a smart rider, choosing the firmer ground, conserving her horse's energy. He found the spot where she'd rested, the small circle of melted snow from a brief fire. She was being careful. She was a survivor. The thought gave him a sliver of comfort. 2 days passed in a blur of pain, exhaustion, and relentless tracking. The landscape grew more treacherous, the flatlands giving way to soaring cliffs and deep, narrow canyons. This was the Devil's Jaw, a place where a man could get lost and never be found. a perfect place to hide, or a perfect place to be trapped. On the third day he found it. Not David. Something else, tucked beneath a rocky overhang, almost invisible, was a small leather-bound book. He recognized it instantly. A Bible. But it was old, the cover worn smooth with time. He opened it, and his breath caught in his throat. The pages weren't just filled with scripture. They were filled with names, dozens of them, written in a cramped, spidery hand in the margins. Next to each name was a date and a single word: absolved, redeemed, or most chillingly, failed. And tucked into the back cover, a folded piece of paper. It was a ledger page, neatly written columns detailed sums of money, government payments for each child enrolled at the Carlisle school. But a second set of columns, hidden beside the official ones, showed much smaller amounts. The difference was staggering. Silas Kane wasn't just a monster. He was a thief, growing rich off the suffering of children. This was what David had stolen. This was the proof. But there was something else on the page. A name Caleb recognized. The lean, wiry marshal from Alder Creek. His name was Deputy Miller. And next to his name, a series of regular payments, listed under the heading Recruitment. Miller wasn't just a former guard. He was a bounty hunter. He was paid a commission for every native child he recruited for the school, tearing them from their families and delivering them to Kane. David hadn't just stolen a ledger. He had stolen the proof of Miller's crimes. This was why Miller was so desperate to find him. It wasn't about a stolen horse. It was about silencing the one person who could expose him for the kidnapper and monster he truly was. A rustle in the rocks above him made Caleb freeze. He looked up, his rifle instantly at the ready. A figure stood silhouetted against the sky. It was Eliza. Her face was grim, her eyes filled with a desperate urgency. "Caleb," she breathed, relief washing over her features. "I found him." He scrambled up the rocks to join her. She pointed toward a narrow slit in the canyon wall, cleverly hidden by a thicket of juniper bushes. "He's in there. He's sick, Caleb. A fever. He's been hiding for weeks." They made their way to the hidden cave entrance. Inside it was dark and cold. A small, weak fire sputtered in the center, casting a flickering light on a young boy huddled under a thin blanket. It was David. He was pale and shaking, his eyes bright with fever. But even in his weakened state, Caleb could see the same fire, the same unbroken spirit that he saw in Eliza. David looked at Caleb, his eyes wide with fear. "It's okay," Eliza said softly, kneeling beside him. "He's a friend. He's like us." She gently brushed the hair from her brother's forehead. Caleb approached slowly, holding up the battered Bible. "You drop this," he said, his voice gentle. David's eyes widened as he saw the book. He tried to sit up, a fit of coughing, racking his small frame. "The ledger," he rasped. You have to show them." "We will, son," Caleb said. "We will." But as he spoke, a sound from outside the cave made his blood turn to ice. The distinct sound of multiple horses, their hooves crunching on rock. And then, a voice, chillingly familiar, echoed through the canyon. "Nowhere left to run, boy." It was Miller. "I know you're in there. Come on out, and maybe I'll make it quick." They were trapped. The posse had found them. Miller stood at the mouth of the canyon, his men fanning out behind him, blocking their only exit. There were at least a dozen of them, rifles ready. Caleb looked at Eliza, at her sick brother, at the single entrance to the small cave. He looked at the Bible in his hand, the proof that could bring them all down, but it was useless if they were all dead. Miller's voice echoed again, laced with sadistic glee. "I've got a rope and a tall tree, thief. Justice is coming to Alder Creek." The posse let out a whoop of approval. This wasn't a posse anymore. It was a lynch mob, and they were thirsty for blood. The cave was a tomb. The air was thick with the smell of damp stone and fear. David was shivering violently now, his fever-bright eyes wide with terror. Eliza held him close, whispering soothing words in her native tongue, a language the schools had tried to beat out of her. Caleb stood at the entrance, a rock of grim determination, peering through a small crack in the juniper bushes. Miller and his mob were dismounting, taking up positions behind the rocks at the canyon's entrance. They weren't going to rush in. They were going to wait. They had time. David was sick, and Caleb, Eliza, and the boy had limited food and water. It was a siege. He's not a lawman, Caleb said, his voice a low rumble. He's a kidnapper. His name is Miller, and he got paid by the head to drag kids like you to that school. He showed Eliza the ledger page he'd found in the Bible. Her eyes scanned the neat columns, her expression hardening into something beyond fear, beyond anger. It was a cold, sharp resolve. I know, she said quietly. David told me. Miller is the one who took us. I remember his face. I remember his snake tattoo. The memory was a ghost that had haunted her for years, a man forcing his way into their home, dragging them away from their mother's desperate screams. It was him. It had always been him. This isn't about a horse, Caleb stated, the pieces clicking into place. The horse theft was a lie, a legal excuse to raise a posse and hunt David down before he could show anyone that ledger. He won't take him again, Eliza vowed, her voice like flint. I'll die first. No one's dying today, Caleb said, checking the load in his rifle. He had his rifle, his pistol, and about 30 rounds of ammunition. Eliza had a small pistol of her own, with maybe 10 rounds. It wasn't enough. Not against a dozen men. Give up the boy, trapper! Miller's voice boomed, bouncing off the canyon walls. This ain't your fight. You and the girl can walk away. I give you my word as a marshal of the law. Caleb let out a short, harsh laugh. His word is worth less than the dirt on my boots, he muttered. He raised his voice, shouting back, The boy is innocent. You're the criminal, Miller. I've got the proof. There was a moment of silence from the posse. A few of the men shifted uneasily, looking at Miller. They were simple townsfolk, ranchers and farmers, whipped into a frenzy by the idea of a horse thief. But a criminal marshal? That was something else. Miller recovered quickly. He's lying. The savage has filled his head with lies to save his own skin. Don't listen to him, he roared. They're murderers. They shot me in Alder Creek. Caleb knew he'd planted a seed of doubt, but it wasn't enough. Miller's authority, backed by a badge and a gun, held sway. The siege continued. Hours crawled by. The sun beat down on the rocks, turning the canyon into an oven. Inside the cave it was cool, but their water was running low. David's breathing grew more ragged. We can't just wait here, Eliza whispered, her eyes fixed on her brother. He needs a doctor. He's getting worse. Caleb knew she was right. They had to do something. A desperate, reckless plan began to form in his mind. It was a long shot, a fool's gambit, but it was the only one they had. Eliza, he said, his voice low and intense. You trust me? She looked at him, her dark eyes searching his. In them, she didn't see a reckless fool. She saw a warrior. She saw the same strength, the same refusal to be broken that she felt in her own soul. She nodded. All right, he said. When night falls, we give them a show. As twilight painted the canyon in shades of orange and purple, Caleb began his preparations. He took one of their 2 woolen blankets and, using his knife, began shredding it into long strips. He had Eliza do the same with the other. He then took their last few spoonfuls of bacon grease and smeared it all over the cloth strips. What are you doing? She asked. Buying us a distraction, he replied grimly. Night fell, bringing a deceptive peace to the canyon. The mob had started a large bonfire, their figures silhouetted against the flames. They were drinking now, their voices loud and coarse. Caleb crept to the mouth of the cave. Miller, he shouted, let's talk. Just you and me. Unarmed, in the middle of the canyon. There was a murmur from the posse. Miller hesitated. To refuse would make him look weak. Fine, he yelled back. But any tricks, and the girl and the boy are the first to die. Caleb handed his rifle and pistol to Eliza. If this goes wrong, he said, his voice soft, you get David out the back. There's a fissure at the rear of the cave. It's a tight squeeze, but it might lead up to the rim. Don't wait for me. Caleb, she began, her voice choked with fear. He put a hand on her shoulder, his gaze steady. We are not defined by the scars on our backs, Eliza. We are defined by the choices we make now. He gave her a small, grim smile. Then he turned and walked out of the cave, his hands raised. He walked into the open space, the firelight from the posse's camp casting his long shadow behind him. Miller emerged from the other side, also with his hands raised. They met in the middle, two mortal enemies surrounded by a circle of armed men. "This is foolish, Trapper," Miller sneered, his snake tattoo seeming to writhe in the flickering light. "You can't win." "This isn't about winning," Caleb said, his voice calm, but loud enough for the other men to hear. "It's about the truth. It's about a man named Silas Kane, and a ledger, and a list of children you kidnapped for money." Miller's face contorted with rage. "Lies!" "Is it?" Caleb countered, his voice rising. "Ask him, men. Ask your marshal where he was before he came to Alder Creek. Ask him how he got the money to buy his stake in this town." Some of the men in the posse looked uncertain. They were starting to question, and that's when it happened. From high on the canyon rim, a ball of fire suddenly erupted, arcing through the night sky. It was one of the grease-soaked blanket strips, tied to a rock and lit on fire. Eliza. As every head in the posse snapped upward to look at the fiery distraction, Caleb moved. He wasn't there to talk. He was there to fight. He lunged not at Miller, but at the ground, scooping up a handful of sand and gravel. He flung it directly into Miller's face. The marshal screamed, clawing at his eyes. At the same instant, a second fireball sailed through the air, this one landing directly in the posse's bonfire. Embers and flames exploded outward, scattering the men who were sitting too close. Chaos erupted. Men were shouting. Horses were rearing in panic. Caleb didn't hesitate. He drove his shoulder hard into the blinded Miller's chest, sending him sprawling to the ground. He snatched Miller's pistol from his holster just as a third and fourth fireball lit up the sky from different points on the rim. Eliza was moving, making it look like they were being attacked by multiple people. "They're all around us," one of the posse members screamed in panic. Caleb fired a shot into the air. "It's a trap! Miller led us into a trap!" he roared, using the confusion to his advantage. The seed of doubt he had planted earlier now bloomed into full-blown panic. The townsfolk, drunk and scared, didn't know who to believe. They saw their marshal on the ground, a stranger holding his gun, and fire raining down from the sky. Their lynch mob mentality evaporated, replaced by a primal instinct for self-preservation. They broke. Some scrambled for their horses, others just ran blindly into the darkness. It was a complete rout. Caleb stood over the spluttering, half-blinded Miller, the marshal's own pistol aimed steadily at his head. The only ones left were Caleb, Miller, and the dying embers of the fire. "It's over," Caleb said, his voice as cold and hard as the stone beneath his feet. But it wasn't. From the darkness, a voice cried out, "Caleb, look out!" It was Eliza. She wasn't on the rim. She was running toward him, and behind her, two men from the posse who hadn't run. They'd circled around in the darkness. They raised their rifles. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. The flash from the rifle barrels. Eliza's scream. Caleb turning, trying to raise his pistol. A searing pain, white-hot and absolute, exploded in his chest. He was thrown backward, the world spinning into a kaleidoscope of fire and stars. He hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from his lungs. He saw Eliza running, saw the men aiming again. He tried to lift the pistol, but his arm wouldn't obey. His vision was blurring, a dark tunnel closing in. He heard another shot, but this one was different. A crack, not a boom. A pistol, not a rifle. One of the posse men grunted and fell. He saw a small, shaky figure emerge from the mouth of the cave. It was David. He was holding Eliza's pistol in two trembling hands, his face a mask of terror and determination. He had fired the shot. He had saved them. The remaining posse man, shocked, turned his rifle toward the boy. Caleb knew he was dying. He could feel the life draining out of him, a warm flood spreading across his chest. But he had made a promise. With the last ounce of strength he possessed, he rolled onto his side, raised the pistol he still held, and fired. The posse man crumpled. Silence descended on the canyon, broken only by the crackling of the fire and Eliza's desperate sobs as she knelt by Caleb's side. "Caleb!" she cried, pressing her hands to his chest, trying in vain to stop the bleeding. He looked up at her, at the stars glittering in the vast dark sky above. He saw her face, her tears shining in the firelight. He saw David safe. He had kept his promise. A small, peaceful smile touched his lips. The pain was fading now, replaced by a strange, floating calm. He had spent so many years alone, hiding from the world, hiding from the scars on his back. But in these last few days with these two broken people, he had found something he thought he'd lost forever. A family, a purpose. His vision faded to black. The last thing he heard was Eliza's voice, calling his name. But the story wasn't over. Not yet. As Caleb's world went dark, another sound pierced the silence of the canyon. The clatter of hooves. A lot of them. A new group of riders was entering the canyon, their torches cutting through the darkness. Eliza looked up, her heart seizing with terror. It was another posse. Miller, still writhing on the ground, let out a triumphant, gurgling laugh. "It's over, girl. You're all gonna hang." But the man at the head of the riders wasn't from Alder Creek. He was a circuit judge, a federal marshal by the name of Isaac Parker, known throughout the territory as the hanging judge. And beside him sat the portly, terrified-looking shopkeeper from the general store. The shopkeeper, a man named Peters, had been horrified by what he'd seen. When the first posse rode out, he'd done what he thought was right. He'd ridden for 2 days straight to the next county to fetch the one man he knew stood for actual law, not mob rule. Judge Parker took in the scene with a sweep of his stern gaze. Caleb's bleeding body, the dead posse members, the cowering, half-blinded Miller, and the two native children standing over their fallen friend. "What in God's name has happened here?" The judge's voice boomed. "Judge!" Miller shrieked, scrambling to his feet. "Thank heavens, these savages, they killed these men. They stole a horse. I was just trying to uphold the law." Eliza stepped forward, her small frame trembling not with fear, but with a righteous fury. She held up the battered Bible, its pages stained with Caleb's blood. "He's the liar," she declared, her voice ringing with clarity and strength. "He's not a lawman, he's a kidnapper and a murderer, and this book is his confession." For the next hour in the flickering torchlight, the truth finally came out. Eliza and David told their story, their voices gaining strength as they spoke. They told of the school, of Silas Kane, of the whip called the Redeemer. They told of the ledger, of the stolen money, and of the children who failed. They pointed to Miller, identifying him as the man who had stolen them from their home. The shopkeeper, Peters, confirmed Caleb and Eliza's story of what happened in his store, how Miller had instigated the violence. Judge Parker listened, his face an unreadable mask of stone. When they were finished, he dismounted and walked over to where Caleb lay. He knelt down, checking for a pulse. A flicker. Faint, but it was there. "He's alive," the judge said gruffly. "Barely. Get him on a wagon. You two," he said, pointing to his deputies. "Put that man Miller in irons." Miller shrieked and protested, but the deputies were swift. They hauled him to his feet, his claims of authority dying on his lips as the cold steel of the shackles closed around his wrists. The judge then picked up the Bible and the ledger page. He read the names, his expression growing darker with every word. He looked at David and Eliza, at the scars he knew they carried, both on their backs and in their souls. "The law has failed you children," he said, his voice softer now, heavy with the weight of the injustice. "Tonight we begin to make it right." They took Caleb back to Alder Creek, not as a prisoner, but as a hero. The town doctor, a grizzled old man with surprisingly gentle hands, managed to dig the bullet out of his chest and stitch him up. For days he hovered between life and death, with Eliza and David never leaving his side. In that time, Judge Parker's justice moved like a flash flood. He arrested Silas Kane at the Carlisle School, using the ledger as undeniable proof. The story of the school's horrors and Miller's role in it spread through the territory like wildfire. The men from the posse who had died in the canyon were not mourned as heroes, but seen as the tragic fools of a corrupt man's mob. Caleb finally woke to the sight of Eliza sitting by his bed, dabbing his forehead with a cool cloth. The first thing he saw was the smile on her face, a real smile, bright and full of hope. "David," he rasped, his throat dry. "He's fine," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He's safe." We're all safe. Thanks to you. They stayed in Alder Creek while Caleb recovered. The town that had once wanted to hang them now treated them with a quiet respect, tinged with shame. The shopkeeper, Peters, gave them free supplies and offered them a place to stay. Judge Parker made one last visit before he left to oversee Kane and Miller's trial. He offered to find a new home for Eliza and David, a proper one. But Eliza politely refused. "We have a home," she said, looking at Caleb. When Caleb was strong enough to ride, the three of them left Alder Creek. They didn't head back to Caleb's isolated cabin, but toward a fertile valley Eliza knew of, a place where the earth was good and they could build something new. They were an unlikely family, a man weathered by war, a woman scarred by a cruel education, and a boy who had stolen back their truth. They each carried scars, permanent reminders of the pain they had endured. But as they rode together under the vast open sky, the scars no longer felt like brands of shame. They were symbols of survival, proof that they had faced the worst of humanity and had not been broken. They were a testament to the fact that even after the deepest wounds, with a little bit of courage and a lot of love, you can not only heal, you can become whole again. Their past would always be a part of their story, but now, for the first time, they were the ones writing the next chapter. The world can be a dark and cruel place, and sometimes it feels like the bad guys have all the power. But the story of Caleb, Eliza, and David is a powerful reminder that the courage of just one or two people can be enough to shine a light on the deepest darkness and bring the truth to the surface. They fought back, not just for themselves, but for every nameless child in that ledger. It's a story about how our deepest wounds don't have to define us. They can connect us and even make us stronger. If you were moved by their incredible story of survival and justice, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We have so many more unbelievable true stories to share with you, and you won't want to miss a single one.